first off, I want to welcome all of you. My name is Arturo Valdespino to your final session this morning for the conference. Welcome to all of you, and I do hope that you all have had a great conference overall and that you and every member of your family is safe. Before I go into what we will be covering this morning, let me go ahead and do some minor housekeeping things that you guys have heard before. As always, we ask that you keep your mics and webcams off so that way the bandwidth for our presenters will be preserved and they'll be able to come in clearly. And also keep in mind that the session is recorded. I think Lorena already went ahead and started that. For faculty development credit, we'll post the sign-in sheet a little bit later, probably in about 10 minutes or so, and the link's going to close right at noon. So make sure that you guys log in and that you're able to access it prior to that. As always, you'll sign in with your EPCC login credentials, and the full attendees list will be downloadable from Teams for anyone without an EPCC login credential. I will also post a conference evaluation in the chat box towards the end of the workshop. Excuse me. Please let us know how we did. It's always huge. And your feedback is always very welcomed. This is the 7th one, but we've already got our eyes towards our 8th conference next year, and we always take your opinions into consideration. As we move through the session, if you have any questions, please post them in the session in the comment box, and at the end we'll collect them and we'll go ahead and ask those to Mr. Fink once he's done with his presentation, and you'll get a chance to have your question answered and to engage with him in regards to everything that's going on. So as I mentioned, I am Arturo Valdespino. I am one of 3 moderators this morning. The other 2 are Lorena Gonzalez and Sue Selk. But I will pass things off right now to Tony Padillo, so that way she can do a formal welcome.
Thank you, Art. Everyone, I'm so glad to see so many of you in this, our 7th annual Dual Credit Conference, virtually this time, right? It is a different experience for all of us. We're not enjoying the wonderful breakfast and lunch provided by our culinary arts program. That's a shame. We don't have that opportunity to network with colleagues from different districts and different departments. But I think that all of you have made this a very successful conference. I am thrilled again to see so many of you. I'm looking forward to reading the suggestions and the comments for the sessions and also for the conference itself. Please hang on at the end. I have a few final thoughts after this keynote speaker. So again, our 8th session of this conference. Great to see all of you here. Art?
Thank you, Tony. All right, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Mr. John Fink. So let me give a little background on Mr. Fink, and then I'll introduce his session, and he'll begin. John Fink is a senior research associate at the Community College Research Center, CCRC, at Teachers College and Columbia University. John's research examines student transitions between educational sectors, aiming to uncover structural barriers that result in unequal access to opportunity for low-income, first-generation, and students of color. John's work at CCRC has provided the foundation for statewide implementation of community college guided pathways reforms in 16 states, and his research has been published in numerous academic journals and covered in dozens of media outlets. In 2019, his research was recognized by the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students with the Transfer Champion Catalyst Award. Prior to working at CCRC, John advised community college transfer students at the University of Maryland. He currently lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania with his wife, Audrey, and 3-year-old son, Carmack. His presentation this morning is called The Dual Credit Playbook: How Colleges, Districts, and Schools Can Strengthen Partnerships to Advance Equity. If you all please would help me giving a nice warm welcome to Mr. John Fink.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony, Arturo, and Lorena for that. Love the music, especially. I was humming along. I kept on getting the note that my mic was muted because I was making lots of noise over here humming to the songs and getting excited to present on this to you. And it's really such an honor to join EPCC and your surrounding community to present on this research. The Dual Credit Playbook, I should note, it's the research I'm going to talk about is actually called the Dual Enrollment Playbook. A little bit of a nomenclature difference there. I wanted to translate as best I could to the Texas context, but of course we couldn't write a dual credit playbook without visiting Texas. And indeed, what the research I'm going to share is based on fieldwork to Washington, Ohio, and Florida, 3 other states with also large, robust dual enrollment programs. But I should say that, especially thinking about El Paso, I don't know if y'all know, but so I do this work nationally, community college reforms, and the sort of the connection into, through, and beyond community college. And I just feel like El Paso is sort of like famous nationally for just the long-standing work as a region of cooperation and collective impact for your students. And I'll sort of share a little bit about, the opportunity around dual credit, dual enrollment nationally and in states, what we've learned from places that have stronger outcomes specifically for students of color. But really, like where I see the work headed is actually towards the model that more resembles this sort of collective approach that we see in El Paso and other parts of the country, Central Florida, Northern Virginia, Central Valley of California, where as a region, there's a focus on the not just the high school to college transition, but using dual enrollment or dual credit as a way to expand opportunity, even starting in elementary and middle school, getting students on a pathway, not just to college, but into specific college programs and into careers that it's involving the university, but also employers, and not just any careers, but careers that are going to really add value and bring family sustaining wages and support the regional economy. And this sort of regional approach, I think, is really where it's sort of where we want to go with this research. I'll share. And we're seeing it in a lot of places nationally, including in Texas. So all that to say is it's really an honor to be sort of speaking with this audience. And I hope that this is useful and sparks some questions and insights. Let me tell you a little bit about the Community College Research Center at Columbia University Teachers College in New York City. We've been studying community colleges and how community colleges can improve and better serve their students for over 20 years. This has been covered a range of topics from developmental education, reform, to advising and holistic student support, transition to workforce, and the sort of economic returns of community college credentials. In 2015, a few of our leading researchers wrote a book, Redesigning America's Community Colleges, that synthesized many years of research and organized that in a framework for community college reform called Guided Pathways, which is a holistic framework meant to help colleges think through how they can fundamentally change the student experience at scale from entry to progression and completion and beyond into advancement for further education and into the workforce. And the set of reform, or the framework reform, has inspired a lot of work across the country, including in Texas. And this is something that we've been studying. And the connection to dual enrollment and dual credit, I think, is really exciting to think about in terms of benefiting our communities. And so I think that's, like I said, it involves this sort of regional approach. And I think that's where we're seeing the research headed. So let's talk first about dual credit, dual enrollment. And the first thing I want to say is that when you think of this broad category of how high school students can get access to advanced coursework, that's when you think of advanced coursework, that's probably like the broadest category. That could include like advanced placement courses, IB, early college high schools. Then there's this category of dual enrollment or dual credit, which, there's different language that folks use across the country. But when I say dual enrollment, I'm sort of speaking very broadly to any arrangement where a high school student, even in some states, a middle school student, can take college courses before they finish high school. But it's not AP or IB or other forms, and it can happen. Sometimes it's referred to as concurrent enrollment. Can happen at the high school, it can happen at the college. You all know this, etc. So just to get on the same page of terms, that's what I'm referring to in dual enrollment, is like this umbrella term talking about all these different types of models, but not AP. I think as you see in this chart, this gets at like the scale nationally of these programs. And of course, AP, advanced placement, is quite large. Now, most recently, I think it's 2.8 million high school students taking an AP course. Of course, many fewer of them take the test and pass and get a qualifying score on the test. The number of dual enrollment students nationally is a little bit hard to pin down because the most recent official count from the Department of Education was in 2010, 2011, and that was at like 1.4 million for that school year. Just as I'll show you in the next chart, projecting that forward, we're sort of estimating that that's around 2 million high school students in the most recent year. And then that's been one of the segment of the community college population that's really grown the strongest over the past 10 years. So of course, there's early college models, which I know is a huge part of the offerings in El Paso. I think it's 20 early colleges, thousands of students. You could have like your own little bar on this chart just for El Paso's and just for Texas's early college students, I think. These are, as I'll share, incredibly strong programs that have empirical evidence around their benefits. But when you think about the national landscape of dual enrollment, there's just many more students taking the sort of dual credit, dual enrollment model. That's like where currently the majority of students are at taking any sort of dual enrollment or early college. The expansion, so dual enrollment, dual credit has grown a lot over the past 20 years. Here's a chart showing the growth since 2001. We're sort of estimating at this by looking at the number of students who are 17 and younger enrolled in colleges. So it's a little bit of a proxy, but when you see a trend like this, it seems like something's going on. And we see not only has dual enrollment grown over the last 20 years, but most of that expansion is happening at community colleges across the country specifically. Some amounts happening at the four-year institutions, but it's by and large through partnerships with local community colleges. So let's look in Texas. So I'm looking at the data from the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board. I think a lot of this is probably stuff you've already known. So dual credit has just expanded tremendously at community colleges specifically. The top line is just all students. And then the two largest groups by race are white and Hispanic students. And really since 2015, there's more Hispanic students participating in dual credit than white students. And when the reason this is so important is when we look nationally, one of the challenges is the inequitable access to dual enrollment, where it's more likely for white students nationally to participate. And part of the motivation of our research is to try to find places where schools and districts and colleges have closed the gap of opportunity to participate by race and income. And we're seeing a lot of those places in Texas. And if we want to just study how these programs can better benefit students of color, Texas is sort of the place to study it. And this is sort of where we're wanting to move our research in the future. It's worth noting too that in Texas, 95% of dual credit is through community colleges. So I'm sure this probably resonates with what folks already know. The other trend that we see nationally and in Texas is that dual credit high school students are making up a larger and larger share of undergraduates at community colleges. And this is the case in Texas, where in the most recent year, 2019, 1 in 4 students at community college is a dual credit student. And we see that it obviously varies a lot depending on the college. Some colleges that are especially losing adult enrollments while at the same time growing in dual credit are more like 30-40% of headcount are high school students. So for community colleges, this is really sort of requiring a shift in strategy to be more strategic and intentional with these high school students. So what we know from a wealth of research, like almost a decade plus of research on the effects of dual enrollment, is that there is really strong evidence of the benefits of participating in dual enrollment, dual credit for students. Especially for the early college model, there's actually been like experimental studies where students are randomly assigned to different types of high schools, showing just these time and time again really strong effects of the early college high school model, specifically for groups who are underrepresented in higher education. And I think that's really important to note. And when you think about like as a system, you have early colleges and dual credit. I think one of the questions is just like, where's the cross-pollination of like what you can learn from the supports and things that are working well in the early college model that you can scale to the dual credit population. In 2017, there was like a What Works Clearinghouse intervention report that sort of summarized a lot of the most rigorous evidence from the Department of Education on dual credit and dual enrollment, and just a range of positive effects among participants, including completing high school, going to college, succeeding in college. There's been more mixed evidence when you think about are the benefits equitable and is access equitable? So is everybody benefiting similarly? And the one including a couple sort of high profile studies in Texas, but I think the one caveat with these sort of approaches, and this is, I think of myself as an action researcher, whereas these research projects sort of set out to answer the question, does it work? What I'm more interested in is where is it working really well and how do we improve it everywhere and how do we make it work for everyone? And so those are more of the questions that we've been asking and I'll be sharing about. And so when you're asking those sort of questions, what you're really interested in is there variation? And there's just enormous variation in terms of how programs are run and structured. And we also see a lot of variation in terms of what the program outcomes are, how well does it benefit students? And so when you tap into that, you're really sort of more getting at, well, what can we learn from places with strong outcomes? So in 2017, I released a study using national data, tracking students who were in dual enrollment as high schoolers, and just where do they go to college after, where do they go to college after high school? And did they succeed in college? And what we saw is a lot of variation, both by state, but also within states, just by institution. In some places, students had stronger outcomes than others. So I'll just give you a little bit of an example of what we found from Texas. So we looked at first, just among students who were in dual enrollment, where they go to college after high school. Do they go back to the community college or do they go to four-year university? The first thing I'll note is that, so this is looking by state, and overall we see really high college going rates. So just going to any college. In Texas, I think it was above 90%. This is a little bit different than the federal tracking period because we're looking 3 years out of high school, but still really high percentage of students going to some college. And in Texas, a large chunk of them going back to the community college, and a lot going to the 4 years. So that's, I put a little star by the Lone Star State there. So I think this really resonates with the community college audiences I speak to and nationally, just in terms of this idea of like yield and dual enrollment as an on-ramp into their community college programs after high school. And for most of those students, they're on transfer pathways. And so it's sort of like you start with us in high school, come back, finish your associates, and continue on to transfer. And so that the involvement of the university partner there, as we would see in regular transfer partnerships, is really crucial. We also see variation state by state in the degree completion rates among these students. Here's looking at the students who went to community college after high school, and you see sort of a range by state of their rates of completion of any college degree 5 years out of high school. And in Texas, you see that a chunk of them are completing at the community college, and about 27% are completing a bachelor's. And this is higher than we would see of just students entering the community college after high school without dual enrollment. And we also looked at these gaps, these equity gaps by low income students versus high income students. And we see across states, and including in Texas, consistent gaps in terms of completion rates among low-income students who participate in dual enrollment versus high-income students. And so we're always sort of looking at this dual lens of completion overall, as well as sort of the closing of these gaps by race and income. So I think if I were to summarize the evidence is that dual enrollment really benefits students. The big challenge that we see nationally is that not everyone has equal access to dual enrollment. And this is data from the 2015-16 school year, so about 5 years old, but it's our most recent data that I analyzed from the Department of Education. And when you just compare, this first bar is just the racial composition of high school students across the country, about 50% white. When you look at those who took any dual enrollment course in the 2015 school year, it's about 65% white. And compared to AP, about 55% white. So we're most interested in the dual enrollment here, but sometimes it's useful as a comparison to the other big acceleration strategy, advanced placement. But in general, what we see is that Black and Hispanic or Latinx high school students are underrepresented both in AP and dual enrollment nationally. So this is sort of the challenge. We know that dual enrollment benefits students, but how do we expand these benefits to all students? So I look at that same data for Texas, and I have some links include in the chat where you can look up even district level results. Although these are dated, you probably have more recent information that you'd want to use. But when we look in Texas, we see that on the same year, sort of same data, just that you have a really large chunk of Hispanic students in high school, obviously, but also almost equal representation among dual enrollment participants. So it's close, 48% of dual enrollment participants compared to 50% of high school students. But where we see more of the gap is with Black students in Texas. Despite Texas having by number one of the largest populations of Black students taking dual enrollment in high school. So it's really interesting to just plot this. This is looking at school districts across the country and just looking at the percent of high school students who took dual enrollment, which is a very broad category here and includes dual credit, concurrent enrollment, and I believe it also includes early college high schools, but it doesn't include AP. So it's a pretty broad definition here from the 2015 school year. But if you just look across the country, you can see like where the deeper blue is, that's where you see more students taking dual enrollment. And what's really interesting is when you compare this to the same map, but for advanced placement. And you really see a pretty visually striking pattern. This is the same scale, the same map, but just dual enrollment versus advanced placement. It's pretty striking. You see this sort of shift for advanced placement more towards coastal and urban areas. Just looking down the middle of the country, like Tornado Alley, sort of, it's really more dual enrollment than AP. And I was trying to make sense of this in Texas, and you know, I'm a little bit ignorant on the Texas geography, but it does seem, and it's sort of hard to see El Paso here, but it does seem like there's more of a shift towards like the Austin and Houston area for when you look at AP. So I think it's just important to note that you know, the prevalence of these programs varies by geography nationally. The other thing we did in the same project when we mapped participation of dual enrollment across school districts nationally is we also mapped to what extent is there a gap between white and Black students participating in dual enrollment and white and Hispanic students. And we sort of show these, again, we have this on our website. All of our stuff is open access. We encourage folks to look at it and use it. But, you know, these maps are quite detailed. There's a lot you could sort of dig into here. But the one takeaway, I think, from looking at a map like these two is just that there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of blue, there's a lot of purple, which is larger gaps, and green, which are smaller gaps on these maps. And in fact, when we look at school districts across the country, we see that about 1 in 5 school districts have no or have closed the racial equity gap in access to dual enrollment. And that raises this sort of question of like, well, what are these school districts doing? Like, what can we learn? How can we share that out to other places? So that motivated this project, the Dual Enrollment Playbook. Essentially, given all this variation in outcomes for these students and access to these programs, what can we learn from places that have stronger results? And to do this work, we worked in 3 states, Florida, Ohio, and Washington, where we had access to statewide administrative data on students to see both the rates of participation among high school students in dual enrollment, as well as the transcript records. So what were their grades in those courses? How many credits did they earn? And where we could also link to the college records and see, you know, what % of these students ended up going to college after high school, and did they succeed in college? Did they persist in their first year? And that was our design, where in these 3 states, we had access to this data. We basically identified combinations of high schools and community colleges that were really strong, both in terms of access for students of color specifically. So we mostly focusing here on Black and Hispanic or Latinx students. So these pairings, high school community college partnerships, had really strong participation rates for students of color, and they had really strong rates of success for these students. So really high rates of earning 9 or more credits, which we've seen as an important sort of measure of momentum in dual enrollment course pass rates, and then rates of matriculation to college and persistence in college. And so we did a set of screening calls, and then we ended up visiting 9 of these sites, which we got through 7 of the 9 of them before the pandemic hit in March, but we did have to do some phone interviews for the last 2. But really, I mean, we talked to folks at district offices, schools, in the buildings, and at the colleges as well. And we met with, the leadership, to the counselors, to the students themselves, instructors, and faculty teaching courses, and families, parents and families. And we had a whole set of protocols, but really the question we were asking is, we found that you had these strong outcomes. What do you think explains? And we sort of unpacked it from there. So here are the sites we visited in those 3 states: Miami, Florida, St. Lucie County, Central Florida, Lorain County, which is near Cleveland, Steubenville, which is sort of bordering on West Virginia and Ohio, and then 3 sites in Washington, including 2 pretty rural sites in the eastern part of Washington state, as well as 1 near Seattle. And it's important to note that, so we did the selection just based on the results, specifically for students of color. And we didn't sort of bound it by any type of model, like whether the courses was taught at the high school or whether they were taught at the college. But we did see a range of models in terms of like where the courses were hosted, who was teaching them, whether there was more of a CTE or career prep sort of focus. And I think that's really encouraging, because what we're seeing is you can have strong results in any of these models. That's another sort of question that folks want to know. What works best? Like, what's better, in the high school or at the college? College instructor, high school instructor? Folks want answers to those questions, and those are important questions. What we're finding is that any one of those situations, you can have strong outcomes. It's more about what you're doing and how you improve in each of those models. So let me share some of the overall findings from this playbook. We organized our findings into sort of 5 principles for advancing equitable dual enrollment for students. So I'll take some time to walk through each of these before I dive into one specifically near and dear, really about the alignment to pathways and programs beyond high school. All right, so the 5 principles. I'll talk about the first 3. So first, setting a shared vision for goals, focusing on expanding access and providing supports and advising to ensure success for students. The first one is really sort of about a mindset at colleges and with their high school and district partners that everyone can benefit from dual credit, from dual enrollment, from any form of college acceleration, that this really has a place not just for the advanced students, but for all high school students, and really starting in middle school and elementary school, with getting students on that track to be able to take and succeed in advanced courses, that this is sort of a vision for all students. From the college side, from the community college side, what we heard, folks talked about the history of their programs and how, dual enrollment, this is a quote from a community college leader, dual enrollment historically has been something that happened to us, or it just sort of like grew and we responded to the growth. And at the same time, our college may have been doing this other student success work and equity work around improving outcomes for students, not in dual enrollment, but there wasn't a connection between those two. And so what we heard from the places we visited is that, at some point years back, there was sort of like a light switch that flicked that thought, oh, actually our dual enrollment program can serve our community college mission in terms of advancing equity and upward mobility in our community. And we should be looking at who we're serving and who we're not in the community, and really build around supports to do that outreach to the parts of the community that we're not serving yet and that we could serve more. And that really sort of led into the second component around expanding equitable access. There's just so many sort of tactical things that we saw from these sites really happening in the buildings, the school buildings, folks on the ground doing this work, guidance counselors, teachers, assistant principals, everything from sending out letters in the mail to families. Did you know you qualify for free college courses? Tracking students down in the hallways, pulling reports of students who were right on the verge of qualifying for these programs but weren't there yet, and doing intentional outreach to work with them and say, hey, if you can raise your grades this much, or we'll get you in the boot camp so you can take the placement test and pass. If we do these things, here's what that can mean for you. It can mean an associate degree before you graduate, or it can mean 30 credits towards a bachelor's in business. So that specific connection and relevance, and using that as a motivational tool to get students near on the edge of eligibility, and to expand as a way to expand the numbers and who's participating. There's a lot on placement testing that has gotten even more interesting with COVID. I know is relevant in Texas too. We could talk about that more. But we saw basically places either where you're working in a placement testing regime or not, finding ways to work within whatever the structures are, whatever the state policies that are, to, with this mindset of how are we going to expand access? How are we going to diversify and actually make these programs more representative of our communities? The folks on the ground, the advocates doing this work, basically having strategies to do that. And a lot of it, I would say, is just like sort of one takeaway, had to do with just disaggregating who's participating in dual enrollment. A lot of folks do this already, but when you disaggregate not only, of all of our dual enrollment students, like what percent are, by race and by income, for example, or gender, but also by schools. So which schools are your dual enrollment students coming from? And which are the schools or districts in your area that you're not serving, and why not? And that was a big transformative shift for the places we visited. I can think in Lorain, Ohio, as well as at Valencia College in Florida. They identified, when they did that analysis, there was just a pretty clear, like 3 or 4 high schools, Title I schools, or really high percent of students of color in those schools that just had, they were large schools, but they had low participation rates, or few students participating in dual enrollment. And so that led leaders to think, what's going on here, and how do we more intentionally reach out to those schools and build, programs that are, whether it's through boot camps, busing, other sort of investments to specifically correct for the fact that we see segregation both, and we see this inequity both within schools, students more likely to participate than others, as well as between schools or across schools, more schools having these sort of opportunities than others. So I think that was a really big theme from this section on expanding access. Of course, and cost and logistics was huge. There's a range in ways folks trying to address that. Even in these 3 states where dual enrollment was free, which kind of seemed like a prerequisite to expanding equitable dual credit, dual enrollment, there's still the cost of textbooks and other sort of logistics. Transportation was a huge one. So be that through providing buses, or working with the transit systems, or offering it at the high school. There's a range of ways to address that. On advising and supports, there was we saw a lot of coordination, which is difficult across the high school and college partners, really to ensure that students weren't falling through the cracks. A lot of that differed based on the model, whether it was primarily at the college or at the high school. It seemed like it was just easier for the advisor or counselor to sort of have eyes on the students wherever they were, whichever building they were taking the courses, So we saw different models of that. But we also saw, tools where advisors could share information back across students, even get into each other's systems, at least to sort of view and see how things are going and pull grades and that sort of thing. So data sharing was important, and building that trust and strong relationships. Kind of paired with the move to expand access, we also saw a lot of examples of expanded support for students, particularly in that first term for those first courses where they're getting acclimated to the college level expectations. Extra supports, through tutoring and other really instructors having that mindset of and knowing that this is like a transition for students, and providing that advising that connects to the relevance and interest for students, about their future directions and careers. In the places we visited, they were really providing high quality instruction. They were about expanding access, but it wasn't in any ways to sort of limit the quality of instruction. It was really expand access, keep the high quality instruction, but add more support in order to get students acclimated to college courses and college expectations, and really to build confidence for being a college student. All the great things that we know already happens in dual credit. It was even more important with this pairing with that expanding access. Supporting faculty to sort of enable that high quality instruction was really important. Providing opportunities to sort of talk about, which, in whichever model it was happening, sort of what faculty members were learning, especially for folks that like the newer faculty that were just sort of beginning to teach these sort of courses, that sort of opportunity to share and learn from their colleagues who are more seasoned. The last sort of principle around organizing teams was really just more operational. Like events like these, essentially, we would see pretty regular occurrence. So the college hosting counselors, really sort of like showing that respect that we're all colleagues and we're all working with these students, and having like regular checkpoints or folks at the college that are working and liaising with specific high schools. And I sort of experienced this a little bit when I was working with transfer students at a university, and we were supposed to really be partnering with the community colleges. It's often hard to just get out of your bubble, especially when you got like fires to put out. But I think, having these regular checkpoints and meetings to sort of sustain and build relationships and make it easier to just pick up the phone and call someone, that really sort of enabled collective support for students. We also saw some really great examples of data sharing and using data to sort of track improvements that were being made and how that was affecting sort of success and access to dual enrollment. And really break the key thing there, I'll sort of just hit on again, is just breaking everything down by the specific school or district partner that the community community college is partnering with. So that's really about like getting the data to be as local and close to practice as possible, in order to get it into the hands of the folks that can sort of do something with it. So let me just make you aware of where you can find the sort of full document, as well as a set of tools around its findings. So I'll share the link, but there's the playbook itself as well as a summary, but we do have a couple of tools that we sort of provided with it that might be useful, including a guide for getting started that has like data templates, as well as like discussion questions and suggestions for sort of organizing meetings. But we also spent some time to take our findings and to put them into this sort of like self-assessment rubric, which we found is a really useful planning tool for teams to sort of like go through. And it has a set of like questions around the specific findings from the playbook. And I think it's just like a good way to like process the findings from this research. And they're sort of split into those different principles. So you could sort of pick one up that you're like, if you're really curious about the access piece or advising, it sort of gives you just like some stuff to work off of. And it's just like a different way to process the findings from the report, aside from just reading it. I know we have about 20 minutes left. I think there's some discussion and maybe some questions, but if I may just briefly highlight this one particular area of findings, really about the alignment, and it's sort of related to advising and instruction around the alignment of dual credit, dual enrollment courses to college programs. And we heard this a lot in the field, this idea of random acts of dual enrollment or random acts of dual credit. Because oftentimes the courses available to students might just be based on whoever's there and whoever can teach it and whichever is available that the college is offering. And I think that sort of gets to some of the randomness that it can often seem, and students are just picking up whatever they can get. But I did want to share, because students are starting their post-secondary journeys, I do want to share just some insights on this, both from research and practice. First is that we know that a lot of these students want bachelor's degrees, and indeed this is the degree they'll need to have family sustaining wages throughout their life in many cases, especially in urban areas. And one of the biggest barriers to bachelor's degree completion for community college students is transfer credit loss. And this is from a study in 2015 that looked at a national sample of students, of community college transfer students, and found that just about 60% of them were able to successfully transfer most of their credits. So that's a lot of students who weren't able to successfully transfer most of their credits to the 4-year. 15% of students essentially had to start over in this process. But the really interesting finding here was just that how much transferring your credits or transferring a large number of your credits mattered to the likelihood of completing a bachelor's degree. So students who did transfer 90% or more of their credits were 2.5 times more likely to complete a bachelor's. And I think transfer credit, we often think about the loss in cost, or that students are losing time to degree that's sort of costing them extra money. But actually, in terms of like their likelihood of completion, transfer credit loss is a really important issue. And this has been studied in Texas. There's been a lot focusing on excess credits and transfer credits. I know recently in the legislature, here's a study from 2014 that looked at matched samples of students who started at a 2-year institution, a community college versus a 4-year, and just looked at the total number of credits, college level credits attempted among students who completed a bachelor's. And we see this in other states too, but the overall story is like everybody's got too many credits, but there's especially a penalty for transfer students or students who started at the community college, suggesting that there is just this misalignment of credits and how they articulate, which more and more is starting through dual credit in high school. So really these worlds of transfer and dual enrollment or dual credit, they are like the same worlds in a lot of respects, with a lot of the same challenges, especially around credit articulation. I'm going to sort of skip over some of this. I will mention, though, that we did another study in 2 anonymous states, where we just looked at how many excess credit students had among community college entrants, those who got a bachelor's degree, how many excess credits they had at graduation. It was about like 27 or 29 extra credits among graduates. So, these graduates are like almost earning a quarter more of a degree. And we see racial gaps here, like that are really problematic. In one state, Black students earning 50 more credits than required. So we see that this is stratified by race as well. But when we look to see like what was their journey to the bachelor's degree for students with more excess credits, with those with very few excess credits, and what we saw is that there's just some indications of that made students more likely to have a lot of excess credits at completion. The first being that they took a 100-level math class after they transferred, so that's not necessarily a good sign of like a seamless transfer pathway if you're having to like redo or repeat a math course after you transfer. In general, students with more credits just took more 100-level courses, and they even took more 200-level courses early on, like as freshman, sophomore. So I think it really raises the question, the ones who had less access credits were taking more 300 level courses. But really the findings here raise this question around, okay, a lot of the advice is like, get your gen eds out of the way, get your basics out of the way, which I think is coming from a really good place. But it does raise this question of, are students taking the right gen eds or the right courses that are all going to apply to their bachelor's degree program? Because it seems like the students who are taking lots of these 100 and 200 level courses, you know, they're not all necessarily applying, because these students are winding up with a lot of excess credits among the ones who graduate. So what we saw in the field is some different approaches to getting at this credit articulation issue. So here's an example from Lorain County Community College, where they've basically taken their transfer work, you know, much like EPCC is like legendary transfer work with UTEP, and they've like taken those transfer agreements and then just basically backwards mapped them into the high schools, aligning them to high school requirements. And they've done this specific to bachelor's degrees in like a major and a university destination. And although students don't necessarily follow this whole pathway, they're incredibly useful advising tools in working with students, so that both the high school counselor and college counselor can be sure that, yes, it meets the high school requirement, and it meets your community college associate degree requirement, and it meets your bachelor's degree requirement. And here's sort of an example of what this looks like. They basically just sort of like line up the high school requirements to the community college requirements, which are sort of aligned to their university partner requirements. The other example I'll give is from Florida, where, you know, I think this is the case in Texas with the high school endorsements, but there's a similar sort of academy model in Florida. And oftentimes in the community college reforms, guided pathways, the shift to like these broad career and academic programs of study or meta majors, oftentimes they might not like totally line up. And so what we saw, and this is the case in Florida, what we saw is the community college, Indiana University College, really trying to do that crosswalking for students at specific high schools and in specific districts. So here's what that looks like, one of their guides for counselors and students at Okeechobee County Public Schools, which, you know, I'll just briefly show you what I think is really cool here for students and for counselors, because it's always the question of, okay, well, I'm generally interested in business or health, or maybe I'm sort of into, you know, working with people, but like, what does that actually mean in terms of like my future? And also like, I want to stay in El Paso. So like, what kind of jobs can I get right here in my community? And how does that relate to, you know, the level of how many years I have to spend in college, and what sort of college program that's aligned to? So what this is doing here is just basically showing the sort of within a particular field, the sort of jobs and careers aligned to different levels of education, and the specific degree programs that they can begin and sort of build a pathway starting in dual enrollment through that college. The other thing that's really, I think, important here is that, you know, we've too long done this like artificial sorting between like career programs and transfer programs for students. That probably is like more problematic than it is useful to students. Students are thinking in terms of these areas like health or business, or, you know, they're not like thinking career or transfer necessarily. And even within a field like health and many others, there's both like, you know, certificates, applied associates, and bachelor's and master's degrees. So you have both career and transfer options there. And so I think that, you know, shifting around more of the subject of interest kind of breaks down this, you know, unofficial and potentially problematic sorting function of basically sub-baccalaureate or transfer and beyond. So I do want to make sure we have time for questions. I've listed a bunch, but we don't have to dwell on these. I'll maybe leave that up, and I'll check the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Thank you for everything. That was a very, very interesting conversation. Let's see. We'll go through some of the questions here. I'll just go straight down the list. We'll start with Mr. Rene Chavez, who's one of the counselors here. Wants to know about the percentage that apply to their major overall in Texas.
Okay, yes. So this is a question. This is a really important question that we don't have the answer to yet. And I think there's actually a legislature to get the post-secondary institutions and the universities to start reporting on this how many credits are applying to a major. And this is a really difficult one to answer because in many respects, just pulling that information, which is typically done through like an individual degree audit, we don't have a systematic way to sort of like holistically pull and archive that information. So that is like essentially the golden question that I think that's like the $1 million question that everyone's trying to answer. And so anyway.
Yeah, great response there. This next question comes from Jennifer Vega, and she's asking in regards to the loss of credits for students and how I guess we as an institution can work to help students avoid that.
Sure. There's a lot of focus on sort of creating the articulated pathways to specific bachelor's and community college degree programs and sort of, basically doing the work, collections of faculty and within departments to sort of align those courses and sort of understand that these are going to transfer, but also apply to these bachelor's degree. So that's a really important step that's really best done locally because if most of the students, for instance, who are getting a bachelor's are going to UTEP, you got to have the UTEP psychology faculty sort of in that conversation, talking about which one, how are we going to start a psychology bachelor's in high school? And then it's a collective effort. But so that sort of mapping work is really important. Oftentimes people start with like the big majors first and sort of go from there. But as important is also you can create these best maps and and get them out there into the world. But if students and advisors aren't using them and not following them or helping as tools or to build a plan, or a student just isn't necessarily sure which direction they want to head in, I think those are the thornier questions that are just as important to get at around exploration and ways that like the first 15 or 30 credits can sort of cover a lot of those bases, because actually major switching is a good thing. Students who switch majors early are more likely to complete, and we want it's late major switching. That's the challenge. So we want students to explore and switch if they're not interested early on. It's the late switch we don't want to happen.
Awesome. The next question actually comes from Ardeen, from Tony, who's asking who's the gold standard for minimizing loss of credit among the schools in Florida, Ohio, and Washington?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to know because, like I said, we don't have good measures on it. We don't actually know places that are minimizing loss of credit because it's hard to measure. But in terms of the practice, I think the ones I shared are probably the ones I'd mention. And actually, what they're doing in Lorain, I think, is something that's maybe translatable to El Paso's context. Because in Lorain, what they're leveraging is the fact that they have this transfer program where they already have these transfer pathways developed with a particular university partner. In Ohio, there's a ton of universities in the area. So what they've done is they go, for business, we're going to partner with this university and we're going to build this pathway, and that's going to be the one that students have this pathway for and they know it'll all articulate. But because UTEP is the major partner, I think you can leverage that to really sort of fix both the major and the destination for students. And once once you have the partner that you're working with, it just becomes a lot easier to figure out the specific bachelor's degree with that partner. Instead of, if you've got 7 universities and you've got 40 majors, you just have exponentially more agreements to figure out. So I think there's, and I think you're already doing this, so I'm probably preaching to the choir here. But actually, I think y'all are really well set up to make this work for students.
Awesome, thank you. We do have a question from one of our committee members, Sorella. I'm going to let her go ahead and ask that of you. Let's see, is she there?
I believe she asked it in the chat.
Oh, she did. Okay, she did ask it in the chat. So I'll tell you what, I'll just go ahead and I'll just read it off. It says, the playbook that you mentioned is organized around the 3 broad strategies, taking into account that we are a border city Are there more specific strategies that we can implement? And if so, what do you feel they are?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can really speak very informed to that question. Yeah, do you mean like bordering states, like country border, or?
Well, the question would be, we're an international board.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we have a lot of dual credit students that do cross the bridge every day.
Yeah. I mean, I think we heard a similar thing, although it's not the same thing in Florida, where for DACA students or undocumented students, like this was because of financial aid, that there weren't that same limitations while they were in high school. So really, this was just like a huge opportunity to better serve these students. And so, I mean, I don't think I can speak very well to that circumstance, but aside to say that this is, for these, for a lot of students, this may be like one of the best options and the most affordable options to get college education. So I guess what I would say is just like full steam ahead,
Right.
You can really do a lot of good.
Well, I actually have a question. Let me see. There are. Yeah, I was just looking through the chat. I actually have a question in regards to the research overall. Vast majority of it is quantitative, and I'm curious about any qualitative data you were able to get from any of the students, particularly in the minority section, who talked about the benefits that they may have seen, or just in general if they feel it's working. Dual credit is in essence a social justice program, right? That's fundamentally what it is, and yet the numbers reflect, at least nationally, that minority students are not taking advantage of it in the context that we wish they would like. And so I'm just curious of any qualitative data that you were able to get, any kind of feedback from anyone really talking about the benefits or even the limitations that they see from it.
Yeah, that's a great question. What we heard is that like dual credit and going to take college courses, I mean, succeeding in college courses is such a boost, to self-efficacy as learners, and the validation from a college faculty member, including a high school instructor that's a college faculty member. It counts. Just matters so much to self-efficacy and belonging. Often, we visited places where students were going full time as college students, mm-hmm. and thought of this as like a way to get into a new setting from their high school settings. We visited schools that were sort of under duress, academically struggling, and they thought of like the college just sort of environment was so different than their high school environment. And a lot of students really felt that was a positive. It was like a clean slate. And one where they were really treated as adults and college students and in classes with adults. That were sharing, all of their experiences and backgrounds. So I think it really can be transformative. The other thing from a student interviews that really sticks with me is just, there's folks were really sort of skeptical of AP. Like the students I heard this frustration of like, I'll take this AP course for a year, and then it all comes down to a 3-hour test, whether I get any credit for it. And, if dual enrollment, I just do the work, and, you pass. And,
Right.
It's just like, there's a big difference there. We heard from students and sort of a frustration with just these like high stakes tests, be it placement or AP.
Awesome. Thank you. We do have one more question from one of the participants. The question is there any data in reference to financial implications to students transferring excess credits?
Yeah, I think it'll be surprising to folks. I'll see if I can include the link to the paper in the chat. Okay, obviously, like lost credits is financially not good for students, families, and for taxpayers. So that's like the big finding. What's interesting is in a couple of states, we did this analysis of like, okay, that's true, but also community colleges are cheaper. So how many credits could you lose? And it's still cheaper to go through a community college and get a bachelor's degree. And it sort of depends on, in these two states, like how much the community college costs. But it does turn out that, students can lose it was between 20 and 40 credits, and still it's cheaper to go through a community college to get a bachelor's degree because, the community college courses are more affordable. That said, that's for the very few students who actually completed. because yes, you could lose credits and it is still cheaper, but it's obviously not as cheap as it could be. Right. And if you lose the credits, you're less likely to complete. And if you don't complete, then it's just all lost. So all that to say is excess credits and credit transfer matters, both for financial reasons, but also for success reasons.
I know we're up against the clock, and we do value your time, but there is one more question, and I think—
Sure, yeah, no, go for it. My toddler's napping, so I got time.
I remember those days too. It would be a great way for you to give us your overall views on it. So we're curious about what do you think the state of dual credit and early college is going to look like down the road? Let's say 5 to 10 years, and your opinion on it, and anything that you think we can do as a learning community to help advocate for any needed change.
Sure. Well, I think that, dual credits and dual early college, dual credit, all this stuff, it's unique in that it has really strong bipartisan support, both in states and on the national level. It's been growing for the last 20 years, and still it's only about 8% of the high school population. So I think that it's really just going to only continue to grow, and only going to grow in numbers, but also significance for communities across the country. And it's really in a lot of places, especially, where the states are picking up the costs, or where students and families aren't paying as much of the cost. It's essentially like the biggest free college program out there right now. So I think it's going to just continue to be very significant. We are seeing a little bit of, everything sort of off kilter with COVID for all these different reasons, but just long term, it just seems like it's going to keep moving that direction. What you all could be doing, recommendations, obviously you have a large complex program that's serving 10,000 students, probably 20 early colleges and counting, a strong partnership with UTEP and a regional focus. I saw there was a session on data. I think this idea of like continuous improvement and looking to see who you're serving, who you're not serving, and using the data as a way to really drive improvement. Data, by data, I mean like thinking about access. Right. That's crucial, but also success and disaggregating things like, GPA, course completion rates, both by student characteristics as well as by districts and by schools, and using that as a way to sort of fine tune the really sort of strong and complex program that you've already built. As well as I know there's also work, like I said, on the credit path, the development of pathways. This is really where we're actually, someone joked, let's have a CCRC study in El Paso. I'll co-sign that. Like Texas and El Paso is actually a really unique place to study right now because of the statewide guided pathways implementation and the community college system, the real focus on improving transfer statewide, and just the size of dual credit and the population that you're serving. So I think there's a lot the rest of the country could learn from what you're doing. So anyway, keep up the good work, and let's stay in touch. Before COVID hit, I really was looking forward to getting down there because I wanted to visit for many years, but it's also been really fun to see everyone's engagement and questions on the chat.
Well, thank you. Well, we certainly would love to have you. And the comment you made earlier about the focus study here actually comes from Tony. And so we'll end with this question. So when are you coming? And what are you doing to focus study? When's CCRC going to get down here?
Yeah, well, hopefully when all this pandemic stuff blows over, trying to see the other side of that. But as we sort of look to the future, this is the sort of work that we'd really like to develop. So let's stay in touch, and thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you. Everybody give the high five clap to.
Thank you, John, so much for this presentation. I think you helped us focus on what needs to be done. I think we have a really good team in El Paso, but definitely we have about 50% of high school students who we don't find right after high school graduation in any post-secondary institution. And so we really are doing a great job with the ones that we have, but we need to find more. We have to engage more students in dual credit. Again, working with our partners at UTEP in those three-way maps, again, is also the challenge, right, of the 2-year and the 4-year institution for every department to work together. So we're working on that, and hopefully we can share more very soon. Again, we want to thank you. I know that you had committed to come to El Paso quite a while ago, but I'm glad that you were able to join us virtually. We're going to be sharing the presentation with the participants so that they can go back and look at links and look at, follow up on the publications. I want to thank everyone for your participation. Again, we were hoping to do this in face-to-face, maybe next year. If hopefully, right, next year we'll be able to meet in person. So Art, I don't know if there's any final messages for the participants.
Yes, just a couple, and Lorena mentioned one right there, not to forget to click out the conference or to click on the conference evaluation. And secondly, guys, check your email sometime next week to see if you won any of the door prizes. All right, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, on my end, thank you everyone for attending. Again, Mr. Fink, thank you very much. And I hope everybody has a great weekend and everybody stay safe.